Aditi will be in conversation with Professor Mukul Kesavan, who is an Indian historian, novelist, and political and social essayist. His first book, a novel titled Looking Through Glass, received international critical acclaim. In 2001, he wrote a political tract titled Secular Common Sense, published by Penguin India. He teaches social history at Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi. He is also the co-editor of Civil Lines, a widely respected journal of Indian writing in English. In 2014, the New Republic included his book, Homeless on Google Earth, in its list of the year's best books. Over to you, Aditi, and Professor Kesavan.
You might be on the right.
I think
You were told.
I was told to angle right.
Okay. By the way, my rating is 4.75.
Oh, I'm a North Indian woman in Bangalore. It affects my rating.
Are we on?
I think so. It picks
Yeah.
up. Yeah. So I would like to welcome you all to the afternoon session of CityScripts, and I'm very thankful to be going after the last session that we had on open access, because I think it helped frame a lot of the questions that we need to be looking at related to the digital domain. So the original idea of this panel was to bring together 3 different perspectives to look at what the platform economy was doing to shape the city of Bangalore. So I thought someone with an academic disposition like myself, a social and cultural commentator like Mukul, and a platform driver, someone who works on Uber and Ola, would bring together a 360-degree perspective on the platform. The 3 drivers that I invited onto this panel were either too busy to come, gainfully employed, or making money doing something else. So it's very hard to schedule time with a gig worker, and it was much more nerve-wracking to expect their responses than to expect a response from Mukul. That being said, I'm very grateful to have you here. Thank you so much for coming from Delhi to engage with us at CityScripts. And I mean, your public writing displays a great amount of curiosity and intuition, both of which we need to start to decode the kind of issues that are taking place with technology now. Since Syed and Gajendra were unable to join us in this conversation, I have restructured what would have been a panel discussion into more of a public conversation, into questions around what technology is doing to the future of the city, to the future of the worker, and to the future of work. And so this brings together insights from about 3 years of my research on the platform economy. And I'll spend about 10-15 minutes in the beginning giving you a brief idea and laying the framework for some questions that I would like to ask you. So I started a research project at IIHS in 2015 looking at the experiences of Uber drivers. The Uber driver is a very ubiquitous figure in our life these days, and me and my colleagues who started this project were very taken by the kind of digital literacy drivers required, the ingenuity of thinking of an informal sector worker doing digital work. We were taken by the massive market size of these companies and how they were only growing, and how dominated our understanding of this was given the kind of investment they were getting. There was little to really no evidence on what these companies were doing to the work experiences of drivers or to their lives. Media reporting around 2015 and 16 was restricted to looking at the high incomes drivers were getting, and this was really mirroring the kind of marketing rhetoric that these companies were putting out by giving drivers high incomes. So we were really unable to question what else was taking place, and that's where we stepped in to try and understand that. And where we sit now in 2018 doing more research with urban workers across different sectors, for example, highly skilled electricians, plumbers, carpenters, we find that measures like demonetization, for example, have made the platform a very dependable, good source of work for workers who took a big hit when the construction industry took a hit during demonetization. So the spread and the vitality of the platform is very important in the city for many people, not just users who are like us in this room. And often this subject matter seems very commonsensical because the people at the heart of this research are people who we meet every day. There are autowalas, our drivers, our carpenters, plumbers who we let into our homes. We often have very intimate relationships with them that go back in our family networks or generations. But I want to complicate this issue for everyone in this audience here and within academic circles, because I don't think we have a very clear understanding of where these technologies are coming from, what values they hold, and I think the last session and what Padmini said really helped set this up. And I think a good way to look at that and to start this conversation is by looking at the role of technology in scripting the story of Bangalore. Bangalore has had many scripts that have come to define its built form and the way it has developed. It was the first, the pensioners' city. It moved on to being an industrial and engineering prowess with in the early 20th century, where massive public sector investment helped set up companies like HAL, BEL, HMT, and other military establishments. And it was these public sector enterprises that formed the pillars of the modern city that we see now. In the later part of the 20th century, this shifted towards electricals, and there was more research and development, brought in more human capital to kind of prime the city for what it is today, which is the country's the world's fourth largest innovation hub. It brings in the lion's share of international and national funding investment for industries of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So it is really these scripts that have brought Bangalore to where it is now. The fourth industrial revolution, if I can just set it up briefly, is what the technologies that were being spoken about in the last session. It's artificial intelligence, it's machine learning, it's automation of manufacturing and service delivery. It's using the digital connectedness of the internet to leverage data to create more efficiencies in the economy. And these technologies impact the service sector as much as they do the manufacturing sector. So they have very real, tangible and intangible ramifications on how cities like Bangalore are set up and they run. The platform is one of the most utilized business models in disseminating these technologies. It is once a technology and a business model, and that's very important to keep in mind as we have this conversation, because what's interesting now is that these technologies are coming to us through private entrepreneurs, through individual enterprise, and not through public investment. And that's really where I want to start looking at for the first kind of point of our discussion, is that what we see now is that we have entrepreneurs that come from a kind of global middle class, whose lifestyles, values are very intertwined with that of people in Silicon Valley or in London, but not really perhaps reflecting what we see in the informal sector, which impacts the kind of values they code into their platforms and the kind of nature of work and relations of employment they create. One of the biggest issues and controversies around the platform economy is that they have created a kind of working system which destroys full-time employment. And this has really been a charge leveled from the economies of America and Europe, where full-time employment was really the crux of how the welfare state and the state was built. Whereas, of course, we know in India there is no full-time employment for most workers in cities. There's heavy subcontracting, and there are little work securities that people have to kind of draw upon. And this is then the condition of the urban economy. There's a paradox at play here, and I think that the nature of entrepreneurship in the city is one of the reasons that this paradox takes place. And so then I think my first question, Mukul, that we can start reflecting upon is that given this celebrated figure of the entrepreneur in our current city discourse and national development discourse, these entrepreneurs are quite undistinguished in that they come from this American understanding of entrepreneurship leads to self-fulfillment and aspiration and to being the change that people want to see. But when we open this concept up to the entire urban economy, the informal economy, how should we start to really look at what an entrepreneur is? And when we start to look at the low-income entrepreneur in this imagination of technology, how do we start to really look at what are the ways in which an entrepreneur protests?
First of all, Aditi, thank you for asking me to be a part of this. It's a great pleasure to be in Bangalore, and I'm completely dazzled by the infrastructural fit and finish of this place, because I teach in a public university, and believe me, it doesn't look like this. And now that I've made you feel appropriately guilty, I can go on. No, the other thing I'd like to say is that um, I was faintly alarmed when Aditi said that the Uber drivers themselves wouldn't be here, because this meant a conversation where I would actually be expected to produce structured insight. And really, if the term domain inexpertise has any meaning, it's my circumstance here at this moment. So I think one of the reasons why Aditi and I got in touch was because in my capacity as a kind of weekly columnist hack, on a couple of occasions I wrote about our relationship with auto rickshaw drivers and then Uber separately, trying to think about our attitudes towards the difference in attitudes towards both. And I think this speaks to your question about what it means to be a small entrepreneur, though I'm not sure that the category actually fits at all. I think one reason why Uber bulks so large in our imaginations is because it's completely transformed middle-class lives. It certainly transformed my daughter's life, who, as a young woman, felt a sense of security and a sense of predictability which she'd never experienced before in a city like Delhi. And the convenience of it is so shocking, and there's, at least to the Indian imagination, there's a kind of magical perfection to the way it works, which leaves me feeling sort of incredulous most of the time. So when we think about it, I suppose it's instinctive to think about, whether this is some kind of poison chalice. I mean, is there a problem? There must be a problem with something that seems too good to be true. And so I think what we have is, we have enormous convenience on the one hand, sort of life-transforming convenience. And then we have questions of what this does to, say, livelihood in a city, or what it does to sociability in the city. How does it change the way in which we respond to service providers? And about this thing about entrepreneurship, let me say that insofar as I understand it, there are some Uber drivers who I've met and spoken to. That's the other thing. I'm not sure about you, but I think a lot of my friends and I speak obsessively to Uber drivers, because there seems something unreal about this context. So you constantly want to know what they're doing and how they got to do what they were doing. There are some people who are entrepreneurs. There are some people who own lots of cars and actually run them like Maliks. But most people I know have taken a loan to buy the car, and don't see themselves as entrepreneurs at all. They see themselves as people who will pay off a debt and will make a living. The thing, though, is that while they complain constantly in the manner of employees about Uber and about the fact that incentive nahi de raha hai, there's no, and there's always a kind of golden age, which is quite odd given that Uber started so recently. There's already a kind of myth of origin, which is, and I've met enough people to know that there truly was a time when they did see themselves briefly as entrepreneurs, because there are so many people who've told me that they cleaned up between 90 to 120,000 rupees a month. And look, I don't know about Bangalore, but in Delhi this is riches. Just to give you a kind of rule of thumb, if you're a tenured lecturer in Delhi, you will make 40 or 45,000 rupees. If you are a reader or an associate professor of a certain standing, you will make maybe $1.5 lakh. And professors don't really get that much more. So if you're making 120,000 rupees, this is a form of entrepreneurship. But I don't think this is true any longer. I was speaking to conscientiously speaking, since I was coming to this event, I was speaking to the Uber driver on the way to Delhi airport, a man called Om, a sort of older man, which was quite unusual because the vast majority of Uber drivers are very young indeed. So he had worked for 22 years in a home in my neighborhood, in fact. And I asked him why he left. And the answer boiled down to two things which were, I think, both very interesting. And none of them had to do with entrepreneurship. What he did was a defensive maneuver, but also something that he felt purged him of a life he no longer wanted to lead. One was the economics of it, because he made 16,000 rupees as a driver with 22 years service, and his employer wouldn't actually raise that money. The second thing, one was a monetary thing. The second thing was that he just didn't like the relationship he was in, though he liked his Malik. You know, he said he was a nice man, but he was a bit of a Scrooge. And every time I asked him for a raise, he'd say, "Wait, तुम तो इधर खाते भी हो." He'd say that मैं तो खा लूँगा, पर मेरे घर में 3 लोग और हैं. You know, this whole sort of laughably, superficially, sort of vaguely feudal benignness that, you know, you eat with us and so on, is precisely the kind of relationship he wanted to opt out of.
Absolutely.
So what he makes now is he makes between, I asked him how much he pays. He says he pays 13,500 rupees as an EMI. And if he didn't have to pay that, he'd make between 30 and 35,000 rupees a month. So I think he's entrepreneurial to the extent that he took an opportunity that got him out of a form of domestic salaried employment. But I don't think he sees this as something that does more than self-employment. I mean, and I think we were speaking about this over the phone, that I think in India, an Uber driver who's making 30 to 35,000 rupees is in exactly the same position as a skilled artisan, pre-demonetization, a skilled artisan who, like a plumber or a carpenter, who could potentially become entrepreneurial, but in all likelihood sees his life as having gotten to a place slightly better than domestic employment and trying to stay there.
And one of the biggest kind of outputs from our research has been the understanding of how the app and how this kind of digitally moderated work is doing to kind of help drivers earn more, which is that for the first time in their lives they have bookkeeping, they have income statements, they have work statements, they have the ability to argue with an employer or a platform as to what they were owed. And very similar to what you're saying about OM, the kind of humiliation and the kind of class struggle that can take place between an employer and an employee, for them seems taken out of the equation when it comes to an app. Yet at the same time, we don't quite understand what the values are that are coded in, that run the algorithms, that run these businesses. And really the kind of, and I go back to the American and European kind of word for this, which is which is the state of being rendered precarious, which is to be a part of the precariat, or to be part of precarity. And we know that in our cities, precarious life means much more than the kind of work we have. It's about the affect of humiliation. It's about the kind of relationships in which you're made to feel little.
Aditi and I exchanged notes about what we could conceivably talk about, and precarity came up, and it was a word that I guessed the meaning of, but I wasn't completely familiar with. So I actually looked up its etymology, and apparently we began using it in the 1920s sometime for precariousness or a precariat. Apparently what comes first is the notion of a precariat, the class itself. And I can see exactly why the gig economy is seen, as you said in your introductory remarks, as something that paves the way to, for a circumstance where there's no employer in sight, where you have a platform with no responsibilities, since it disclaims the status of an employer. But I think you're absolutely right when you speak about the reassurance of bookkeeping, of dealing with bank statements, because I think while in fact Uber everywhere, including in India, is the very definition of the gig economy, but for India, given the fact that our non-salaried urban spaces have always been precarious almost beyond definition. I remember my aunts and my mother, who had many qualities, but they were born around 1916, 17, 18, and their attitude towards domestic servants was, looking back, both horrible and extraordinary, because one of the ways in which you demonstrated your lack of dependence upon a servant was the ability to fire him or her immediately. As we say in Hindi, rato raat, in the sense that you dismiss them. And, even as a child, it occurred to me and many others, what do they do? Because along with this would go the statement, quarter khali kar dena. So you were literally unhoused and unemployed in literally the same day. So I think when you come from this base, to define Uber as the harbinger of precariousness is completely laughable, because to every Uber driver that I have spoken to, Uber represents a kind of hard-won, hard-working stability of the sort he has never known before. So, for example, one of them told me that the best thing about Uber was that he got paid every week on the day. That there was never ever any hiatus between the time he was meant to get paid and between the time he did get paid. And he used to actually drive a Kali Pili taxi before in Delhi, the ones that used to be stationed, unlike Bombay, in sort of spaces carved out of neighborhoods where they slept in the cars, where they were there all night. And he said that the real difficulty with being a driver was that A, you slept in the car. You literally, talk about precariousness. You slept winter nights in this car. And B, your Malik essentially had you over a barrel. If he didn't want to pay you, there's nothing you could do about it apart from returning to your gown.
Absolutely.
So I think to use a sense of precariousness as a way of measuring what happened to Indians with Uber is actually to look at things the wrong way around.
Absolutely.
Regardless of how fundamentally non-responsible they are for the well-being of the people whom they harness with their platform, I think they've brought a kind of urbanity, a kind of a set of bourgeois norms which people, however much they grumble, are passionately committed to. Very few Uber drivers are likely to revert to a circumstance unless they are absolutely forced to, which doesn't involve this.
Absolutely, and the ability to work for oneself is one of the most powerful rhetorics that this company has, and very rightly, as you pointed out, what I think that these companies are doing to the work of informal sector workers is organizing their work experiences where they've never had an organized set of work experiences before. But really to bring up precarity is to also kind of question the role of the state in the understanding of employment and the company and the worker. If you look back, if you look at the kind of discourse taking place in the West, it's about a waning, a recession of the state. It's about the state having lost its sovereignty to capital, much like individuals have, but now it's the state that's done it. Whereas in India, the state has always been, has had the imagination of welfare, but has never really been the provider of it. So, how do we start to then think about the ways in which the state can step in? Because it's very interesting to see that in Delhi, there was a Delhi-based aggregator driver association that took Uber and Ola to court in the middle of 2017, which said that these companies are exercising too much control and supervision, as the legal terms go, that prove that they are actually employers of drivers. And to prove this, they went back to the examples of Uber in London, as we were talking about earlier, Uber in New York and San Francisco, where city courts have really been able to clamp down the company. Now, this imagination is very confused, and there's a paradox. So, where do you think that we can? What kind of historical examples can we use? Where do we think that the state can step in these private enterprises?
The one time the state stepped in Delhi that I can remember, it stepped in on behalf of consumers and not Uber drivers at all. So it stepped in and said that you can't surge, that essentially we'll cap this, and this lasted for the duration of the odd even thing. And it represented a political gesture. Yeah, I don't think it represented any concern with the welfare of Uber drivers. It was also, it's interesting you mentioned this 2017 case by aggregators. Who are these aggregators? Do we know?
The writ was filed by an association of drivers that work for aggregators of Uber and Ola.
Okay, who work for. One of the things that was interesting about the Aam Aadmi Party's intervention in this was that it was seen as partisan. Because auto rickshaw drivers were seen as a large constituency, not just a constituency, as a kind of driver for mobilization and campaigning. Because this was very marked, this was very obvious that there was a sense in which the Aam Aadmi Party, in that era when its political imagination seemed interesting and novel, whether you agreed with it or not, had managed to mobilize the sense of aspiration and grievance that people within the interstices of urban life in India had. People who lived in unauthorized colonies, who drove auto rickshaws, who had to pay enormous premiums, sometimes approaching 5-6 lakhs to actually buy the license to drive an auto rickshaw. People who went to municipal schools like the ones in Sangam Vihar, which served them miserably and very badly. And I think there's something that the Aam Aadmi Party did, which was interesting, except that there was no insight that they brought to bear upon this Uber thing. What can the state do about this? I'm not an expert in these things, but as someone who has some experience of being a citizen of a large Indian metropolis, I would say that given the fact that the interventions in New York and San Francisco and London have effectively yielded zero results. I mean, there's nothing that's actually happened to force Uber to take on the responsibility of welfare. And it's not clear to me how this in fact would actually happen. And if there is a precedent for this, then clearly everybody in India will learn from it. But I think what's interesting for me as a citizen of Delhi is that what the state can actually do is, if we are talking about urban transport and not merely platform employees for a moment, is one of the best things that happened to Delhi was the metro system. There was an enormous controversy about this, whether this was the best way of spending the money, whether you should not instead have BRTs instead. But what the state eventually did was spend vast sums of money in a way that only the state can, building a huge piece of urban infrastructure, which was, I think, initially aimed at at commuter traffic, a kind of radial set of spokes that brought people in and out of the city, but now increasingly is beginning to be seen as something that connects different parts of the city. So I think the state can do what it does best, which is create alternative transport infrastructure. I'm not sure that the Indian state has any wish to do, or the capacity to rethink Ola and Uber. Has there actually been any, from inside the state, has there been any loud thinking about this, about what they could do?
There have been a number of very positive responses from different state governments and central ministries where very productive partnerships have been created towards skilling and micro-entrepreneurship, which has been quite an interesting kind of development to see, where these companies are facilitated by the state, by the city, to continue to run these very efficient modes of transport. Because one of the biggest kind of narratives we have about urban transport is the delays, the inefficiencies, like again going back to the imagination of the auto wala, and how minutely we have to deal with their kind of emotional range within the moment of that kind of transaction of getting on auto. But I mean, thinking back to how do we start to humanize these efficiencies, which we are now of the auto walas, for example, which we are now seeing as very traditional and laggard and kind of illustrated by these delays.
One of the interesting things about the coming of Uber is that it's wiped out the yellow cab completely. I mean, there are a few places where they still exist, but really speaking, nobody relies on them in any default way. So they're gone. But it doesn't seem to have affected auto rickshaw drivers in the same way at all. And given the fact that we routinely, all of us within the middle class, constantly moan about the auto rickshaw. The auto rickshaw is kind of metaphor, as you said, for everything that's wrong with being desi, or everything that's hideous about being in a desi city. That they're open to the elements, they don't work, they're a form of jugaad, that the people who ride them, who drive them, are scamsters, that they represent a danger to life and limb, that they are polluting. So every conceivable it's kind of litany of complaints, and they actually, the sum of which is greater than merely its parts, because the sum of which is basically an aspirational dissatisfaction on the part of Indian middle class with the urban mess that they have to live in, a kind of sense of universalist entitlement that, you know, I'm a middle class city dweller, I deserve better than this. So I think Uber is a foreign country. You know, when you enter an Uber cab, you enter a zone of harmony. You know, you enter a place which is air conditioned. You enter a place where you don't have to talk to the lower classes because the app does this for you. And in fact, the complaints about Uber are a kind of sort of metastasized version of the complaint against the auto rickshaw driver, which is, I have to talk to the wretches on the phone. Aren't they incredibly stupid? You know, they're really dumb. I mean, the kind of awfulness that you hear by way of complaint is that, you know, there's a speck in the ointment, but otherwise these are really great, because, and this is true, they do in fact transport you into a zone of predictability, which is climate controlled. And really, honestly, how can you complain about that? And at least I notice, when you speak about humanizing efficiencies, I notice that Delhiwalas, who are not notable for their sense of sociability or civility, are in fact politer to Uber drivers than they are to people in auto rickshaws. I mean, one part of this is not profound. You know, the middle class in India tends to dump on people who they think of as part of a serving class, and tends to be more tentative in the face of someone who's clearly not their social equal, but who is sort of free range poor, you know, as opposed to domesticated poor. So if you're, there's a sense in which one of the difficulties people have with auto rickshaw drivers is that they're free range poor. You know, they seem to be awkward, they seem to talk back, they seem to have designs upon you, and they shouldn't. The Uber driver is different. He's not just free range poor. The Uber driver begins to edge into blue collar respectability. And you respect the air conditioning, you respect the efficiencies of this remote application, you respect the harmony in which both of you dwell, you respect the fact that this person is actually paying off monthly installments. You know, nothing creates a greater sense of camaraderie within the middle classes as the recognition that this person is doing what you're doing. You know, and it's true. I mean, I don't even mean this comically.
Absolutely.
There is, you know, it's like respect. You know, you're paying 13,500 rupees, you know, a month, and you're going to do this for 4 years. And so there is a kind of equalization that happens. I don't think that, I think Uber is a civilizing influence for very specific reasons, in a very specific way, in the sense that you don't rage at the person in the way that you would rage at an auto rickshaw driver. Because you see the auto rickshaw driver as symbolic of everything that's wrong with your urban existence, and you look at the Uber driver as some, you know, magical intercession that is too good to be true. And I think it affects your levels of sociability with both.
The discursive modernity that comes with an app is so much stronger than anything that we can see physically in front of our eyes. Yeah. Absolutely. But I want to kind of pick up on something you said earlier, which is about how your daughter feels so much safer traveling in Uber and Ola cabs. And as a female customer and user, most of my salary does go into being transported on these platforms. But the Uber driver, as you said, is a more modern image. He is someone who we have more respect for. And rightly so, we occupy very intimate spaces with them. And the intimacy of the Uber cab seems to be more emphasized because of the kind of digital relationship that we're in. But at the same time, given the rape case that happened in Delhi, given the number of sexual harassment complaints around the world to do with Uber drivers, the complaints about what kind of civic information is available to companies about the criminal pasts of drivers, and the liability they have, the Uber driver is equally constructed as someone who is a dangerous man. And what I've seen from the kind of qualitative and ethnographic research that I've been doing is that this paradox rests heavily on the body of the Uber driver, where it causes as much anxiety as it does. That balances out the freedoms of being a micro-entrepreneur, not having to be humiliated by an employer. Many Uber drivers will say that there are drunk women in the back of our car and we don't know what to do with them. They can't handle themselves, we can't touch them. There are a lot of cases where the men that are associated with female passengers will beat up Uber drivers who they feel have misbehaved with them. So it's a very interesting paradox, and like looking at the kind of figure of the Indian man, that's something you've written about a lot. Looking at the figure of the service worker, who comes with these kind of tags just as much as with modernity. How do we start to make sense of how to look at this male service worker?
First of all, a disclaimer. I don't think any man can in a sense, reproduce in his mind the sense of vulnerability that that women feel in circumstances like this. My wife once said to me when I was we weren't married then, but I once had a passage of arms with a bunch of skinheads in a provincial English town, and I was very shaken by this. And when I told her about this after a while, she said that, welcome to being a woman in India, that this is a circumstance that we live through a lot. So with that disclaimer, I will say this though. I'll trot out this chestnut, as the father of a daughter, so there I said it. There's a sense in which it's completely clear to me in Delhi that the principal danger of sexual assault that women face comes in 2-3 directions. One, it comes from large cars with tinted windows that try and drag young women into these cars at bus stops. This actually happens. I don't know whether it happens in Bangalore, but this periodically happens in Delhi. It also most famously happens when lonely DTC buses find state employees collaborating in rape. So you're much more likely to be raped on a lonely bus where there are 2 or 3 men available to pin you down than you are, I think, in either a Uber cab or an auto rickshaw. That said, to make a generalization about this is obviously absurd, as this case that you mentioned demonstrated. But the truth is that our notion of, say, auto rickshaw drivers as dangerous has something wrong with it, simply because the safest place to be on a Delhi street is in an auto rickshaw, because it's open from every side. I mean, it's essentially a tin can. It's a tin can with cutouts on 2 sides. It doesn't travel that fast. It's in full public view. Ubers, like all cars, are enclosed, and conceivably bad things could happen there. But, like you, I've spoken to auto drivers who feel extraordinarily vulnerable. What they were saying is that nobody actually thinks of how vulnerable you are when you're driving 2 men who are drunk behind you, and you're going off into the peripheries of a city at night. You feel genuinely vulnerable, and it is the case that they are beaten up. There's no question that people who drive cabs and scooters are physically vulnerable. I'm not sure, though, that these are the principal arenas of sexual assault, though. I mean, I think, I think it's possible that this happens there, but I think it's to do with just a general pervasive sense of fear in say, transacting Delhi streets at night.
As I think of, again, the city taxi schemes that I've been reading and trying to understand how these companies are being regulated and how the taxi industry is being regulated, there's not much mention of the driver in these schemes and in these policy documents. What really is mentioned is the firm, the taxation, the medallions, the licenses, and the modalities of how the financial ecosystem works with that industry. But there's always a clause at the end of a city taxi scheme across the country which says, which asks for I'm not sure what authority, but the taxi firm to regulate the moral conduct of a driver.
Yeah.
Where there's a very precise wording in each city taxi scheme that says drivers must behave in a certain way towards female passengers. And I think that the mere fact of that being in a policy document like that also brings me to think about how little respect there is for a service sector worker, where in the imagination of the country, different kinds of economic actors have had much better position. Can we draw upon the experiences of auto drivers in Delhi, the kind of political agency they have, or other kinds of social movements to think of how can we start to build respect and empathy for service sector workers, because it is such a large part of how this country is developing and cities are developing?
I think it's very difficult because 2-3 years ago, the people in charge of regulating autos in Delhi said that we have linked up with some alphabet soup, some multimodal agency that will install an alarm button in all auto rickshaws that passengers will be able to press, and a kind of central hub will know exactly what's happened. You know that in Delhi, auto rickshaws had to install very expensive meters, very, very expensive meters, which are designed with such fiendish cleverness that you can't actually read what they say, because in the old meters you could actually clearly see these digits snapping into place. Now you have to peer into a fuzzily illuminated screen to see whether it is 25 rupees. I think one of the reasons these were installed was because they had GPSs in them. Some notion of surveillance, some notion that the way it was sold to the auto rickshaw drivers was that maybe you'll be part of a kind of aggregator platform. So it will be sort of Uber-like. That never happened. So it's a dead letter. I think there's a very real sense in which this demonization of the auto rickshaw driver, especially, is so pervasive and across political divisions. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. Auto rickshaw drivers, from one point of view, are unclean menials. From the other point of view, they are sort of lumpen. And so whether you're left or the right, they're creatures undeserving of your sympathy, because A, they're not properly proletarian, as a kind of left party would want them to be, and they're petty bourgeois or whatever. And on the other hand, they don't meet the standards of comfortable bourgeoisie. So I think that what we've already noted is that with Uber, when we talk about service providers and when we talk about improving attitudes, I assume that you're talking about middle class people, because these are the principal consumers of this.
And policymakers.
And I think it makes complete sense for a politician in the wake of a bad incident to make large gestures about controlling rampant male sexuality and locating that rampant male sexuality within a group of people who are actually pervasive and who happen not to be privileged, who happen not to have unions. Because one of the interesting things about say solidarity and what these platforms do to solidarity is, I think there have been a couple of occasions where there's been an attempt to go on a kind of Uber strike. These are almost by definition only partially successful, because it is so atomized and people are so focused on paying their debts off quite naturally that it's very difficult to get everybody off the road. But it also seems to be the case that, interestingly, auto rickshaw strikes used to be generally more successful because they were also backed up by the threat of violence. That in the sense that you would, if you cross the picket line, as it were, you would be strong-armed. But somehow, I don't know what it is, I can only speculate, somehow the Uber seems to be a step up into a kind of gentility and a kind of self-absorbedness which doesn't allow for such solidarity. So I'm not sure how you can create a lobby or who that lobby would be, apart from well-intentioned policy planners. Who would that lobby be to try and argue that you shouldn't assume that these people are rapists by saying that they should behave properly with women. I mean, I can think of whole categories of male employees in India, in many industries, who could do with that warning as well. You know, why especially auto rickshaw drivers?
Yeah, and I think just carrying on with that kind of idea of respect, what you said earlier about how we have so much more respect for the Uber driver because he is paying the debt that we pay, and they are now kind of connected to these modernities is a way that we have to again start to think about what kind of citizen is at the moral kind of center of this country, because there are a lot of industrialists who have started to see that these companies are formalizing workers, that there's a kind of ingenuity around the fact that an informal sector worker is now paying taxes, they are now putting their money into banks and using them for productive uses like buying a car, owning assets, and it's quite a malicious use of the word formalizing, because we've seem to have let go of this imagination of welfare and social security altogether. On that slightly dark note, I want to open the question.
I just to as a kind of footnote to that, I think that's an interesting thought. That I don't think I think say the present central government has bought into this notion, for example, that are subjects of debate elsewhere. So the notion of, should welfare be in kind? Should welfare be through cash transfers? And I can see the impatience with, say, the welfare culture of ration shops because of the kind of leakage and corruption that became sort of legendary of it. But many of these, these truths are also legends. There's also a sense in which I can remember a time when every middle class person went to a ration shop. And you didn't hear, you heard complaints about the fact that they've run out of kerosene or they've run out of sugar. I think the middle classes are not willing to support an entitlement that is not a universal entitlement. So if they can have a piece of it, as they did at the ration shops, they'll support it. Which is why many policy planners will constantly advocate that entitlement shouldn't be means tested often, that they should in fact be universal, because without middle class support, any entitlement that is not universal has any form of welfare which has no chance of succeeding.
I would like to open up the kind of discussion to the audience. There's a hand that's gone up over there. Is there a mic? It's being recorded. But yeah, why don't you start to speak?
One of the things that came up about behavior and how in Delhi perhaps Uber drivers are treated better than Uber drivers. I think there's also one point that you'll miss there, which is about the rating. So the Uber driver in return is also better behaved because he knows you're going to give him a star rating. So I think in that way behavior kind of is also affected. The second thing is about the taxi services in Malviya Nagar, for instance, which still cater to a few families where trust has been built over years, where actually complaints of harassment are taken seriously. And so no matter how much we complain about women feeling insecure or uncomfortable in any of these spaces, Uber or Ola, it'll just become news one day on Facebook, we share 30 times and that's the end of it. But I think in these localized systems, there's still a sort of a trust exchange, which is not just star-based rating system.
This is certainly true.
I have a friend who spent a month in hospital because he had major surgery. And his wife, who's also a friend, was saying that one of the great joys of having a local taxi service, a Kali Pili taxi service, was that they were way more expensive, but they were always on call, in the sense that you didn't have to deal with a new person. That person knew where you lived, that person knew you, had a stake in you, and this was something that was irreplaceable. Sadly, I don't think this scales. I think there is a way in which the taxi system as it existed in Delhi before Uber had certain conveniences, in the sense that you established a relationship with your local taxi stand. But they were vulnerable in precisely the ways that Uber is not. They didn't always have taxis when you needed them. They also were miserable places for the people who were not Maliks. It's easy to sentimentalize the Kalipili taxi until you look back to the times when, the reason they smelt really bad was because most of the people who drove them actually lived in them. So yes, I think there are qualities about a local cab service which are irreplaceable, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure they scale in a way that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, about ratings. Yes, I think the ratings thing is interesting because, by the way, my rating is better than hers. Mine is 4.75. I just discovered this because now this is a new thing. It actually tells you.
Yeah, before you had to go into the app to find it, but very interestingly, just to kind of pick up on what you were saying, I mean, the trust that you're talking about is again very one-sided. It's that your family felt trust. It's that you had the experience of knowing that you were going to be safe at whatever time at night. And originally when these companies started in America, for example, there was a two-way rating because both users of the platform were very, in the same class. It's interesting to see now how a company like Ola Cabs, for example, will not show you your rating as a user. Whereas Uber now has started to introduce this concept slowly through the platform, through the app, through the actual physical, visible aspects of the app, to start to look at how to be more respectful towards drivers and to have the responsibility of being respectful towards them as well.
Yeah, I was just saying that, you mentioned, I think this is a completely good thing. I mean, for a middle class person to be rated by a socially inferior must be one of the most chastening things that he can think of. So while I can see that it can't be great for the driver because you feel a sense of this remote, abstract calculus which determines your standing within Uber, detestable the Uber is in many ways in its sort of corporate culture and so on, the notion of a two-way rating is, completely subversive in our context. I didn't know what my rating was, and when I saw it as 4.75, I felt vaguely competitive. I said, who are these people who are 4.9 and stuff, So I think it's a good, I think some of these things are some of the things that the digital world enables, and not enough, alas, but are genuinely democratizing, because as I said, it's, I just think that we should remember whenever we talk about sociability and livelihood in Indian work circumstances, since our most common point of reference as a kind of Anglophone middle class is with the Anglophone West. I remember a Bengali friend of mine, after spending 2-3 years in England, saying, "What a class-ridden society this is." And I looked at him and I thought, what? But I see what he means. You can only have class when you have a mutual acknowledgement of humanity. In the context of Indian urban spaces, without being melodramatic about this, you don't have class divides, you have chasms between people who are who form your working definition of being human and people who fall out of that. And I don't know about Bangalore, but in Delhi, this can, this is graphically illustrated at every traffic light, in the sense that everybody in Delhi develops street blindness, selective street blindness of a certain kind, because there's no place in the world that any of us have ever been to where you see immiserization and misery on the scale in which we do in our nation's capital. Legless, limbless people, transgender people having to turn tricks, little children going literally through little iron hoops. And I think in a spectrum this translates upwards. It's not just the sort of lowest of the low, it's also the case that our entire relationship with everybody else is a kind of negative way of saying, thank God that's not me. And how you insulate yourself from that, because the other thing is that when you talk about attitudes and humanizing things, one of the difficulties of living in an economy that's been characterized historically by a scarcity of everything is, a terror of being becoming, déclassé, of ceasing to be middle class. I still remember my mother, when I did badly in the missionary school I was sent to, would with complete psychological accuracy point to a government school in the neighborhood saying कि अगर तूने homework नहीं किया मैं सरकारी school भेज दूंगी तुझे. And even as a child I understood what this meant, that this meant in a sense falling out of what it meant to be human. So I think anything that Uber does, wicked though it might be, to force us to enlarge our circle of the people we think are human enough for us to be civil to, is I think something to be celebrated.
I think
I just had a question on the Uber model. Is it different in India to where it is elsewhere? And I ask because you raised, the entrepreneurship, and then Mukul spoke about the economics of it, and clearly that 35,000 with 13.5 to an EMI, it sort of makes sense. But I wanted to ask if this model is more exploitative in India than it is elsewhere, in the sense of the drivers taking on all the risk. I don't know.
the business model itself is quite universal. It's very interesting how the company of Uber started functioning. It's of course changed now. Its corporate culture is going through many changes, but between 2009 and 2013 and 14, when Uber was setting up shop in different cities, what they would do is to have a very agile small team that goes and sets up and adapts the model to local conditions, but the model remains the same. Everyone, the kind of costs of ownership of assets are all transferred onto the driver. It's their responsibility to earn.
In fact, I'm glad you asked this question about the model, and I don't know enough about this to be able to make a comment, but I do have a larger question which I hope someone can answer, which is, what is the business model? Because it seems to me that Uber its valuation is extraordinary, but it's been hemorrhaging money ever since it was set up. Just hemorrhaging money. It's just that people see it as the future, and it's bid up to a point where it's enormous. Because I remember when the first arguments about Uber began, and basically they were between those who were saying that, stop being absurdly politically correct about something that is a gift. Don't look this gift horse in the mouth. It's self-evidently good, and there were other people who were saying there were all kinds of things that are wrong with it. And for example, this whole notion of why is surge pricing good for Uber when an autowala asks you for more than his meter can bear, why is that wicked? Because in a sense, just as Uber is trading on your desperation or a kind of mismatch between demand and supply, that's what that lone autowala is saying, that you're in a fix, I've got you over a barrel, so pay me more money. So why is it that you'll accept the one and not the other? And it struck me that this notion that say Kejriwal was being Luddite by capping the surge, or that he was like Mohammed bin Tughlaq trying to set the prices in the mandi, whereas in fact the market is what would have done this. This seemed manifestly absurd, because Uber has a base rate of I think 6 rupees or 650 per kilometer, which is absurd. Any scooter wala will tell you this is a ridiculous rate. Nobody can even break even on this rate. Om, who I traveled with this morning, said that basically that 6 rupee rate is almost never applied. It goes 9, 12, 15. This is how the rate changes. But even that doesn't even begin to cover Uber's expenses, even having divested themselves of all responsibility for their drivers. This is a company that still hemorrhages money. So my question is, why is Uber represented to us, convenient though it is and wonderful though it is, and long may it live, why is it represented to us as a poster child for the market? When it seems completely obvious to me, and I'd like to be corrected if I'm wrong, that this is the services equivalent of dumping. Just as people dump commodities, which they've manufactured a great deal of, and they dump to do many things, including gain market share. It seems to me that I can't see the business model, because one of the reasons why we were all weaned on to Uber was that for a long time it was cheaper than your black and yellow cabs. And even now, despite the fact that it's more expensive. It's not more expensive than a black and yellow cab. And the reason it's not more expensive is that there is somewhere a distortion of the market and a subsidy. Because Uber runs because Uber can afford to lose money. How is this a business model?
I think what's really important to keep in mind while thinking about how to answer that question, and there is no clear answer, is that as these technologies build and evolve, so does the business model. So I think expecting a company like Uber to have a rationalized business model is expecting a lot more. I mean, giving them too much credit where it's
No,
not due.
my small point was that the argument is often said that Uber represents the market, that Uber represents market forces harmonizing supply and demand, that the secret sauce and the algorithm does things that creates this perfect market, or as close to a perfect market as you can get. But in fact, it's a perfect market underwritten by financial assumptions that no other operator can make, simply because you have pockets that are so deep that you can afford to pay for this forever, which raises the question, is it a kind of Amazon stroke Walmart style bid, where essentially this is the bait, and when they switch, effectively they own the market, and whole ecologies of work are effectively asphyxiated because of this behemoth that has taken over your life, and then in a sense it controls this entire sector of transport, which seems vaguely conspiratorial, and I feel odd even saying this, but I don't understand. I agree that the model probably evolves, but
No, you're completely right.
it doesn't seem like a poster child for the marketplace here.
I think we can take one question and then we'll wrap up. Aditi.
Thanks very much. That was an excellent discussion. So kind of to respond to your question and also kind of other things that have been said during the talk. I think there is a danger of depending too much on what we think of as anecdata, and I think because a lot of this is coming from conversations. But having said that, my own kind of conversations with Ola drivers, it sounds like a name of a book or something, but have kind of led me to believe that, to emphasize what you're saying about being slightly conspiratorial and kind of thinking that there's something going on here, is that it is a black box technology. No one actually knows the way that they're switching algorithms to measure performance. So in conversations that I've had with drivers, it often seems that a lot of them feel that their performance is not being measured by the paradigms that they were told that they were being measured by. Apparently, when you cancel an Ola or an Uber, or I think this is only for Ola, this idea that cancellation, like you incur a charge, that means that but that money goes directly to the company, not to the driver. And they're apparently saying that a lot of the time they are not actually cancelling and it's coming from above. So I think the problem is that this is across the board a black box technology and we don't know what the algorithms are. Just like anyone who does research on Google, for example, we're constantly reverse engineering what we think Google is doing or what Facebook is doing. And that is the reason why it seems to not make sense, because I think you're completely right in saying that it's that kind of Amazon mentality of kind of undercutting and keeping the price as low as possible, and then hoping that the shares and the market share will be so large so as to, and also not to forget that this is a Silicon Valley based ideology, so there's venture capital, blah blah blah. But I think having said that, I think the problem is that none of us researchers, academics, actually know. And so what we need is a Uber, Ola whistleblower, really, to kind of get more kind of pertinent information that we can work backwards with. And the other thing that I just kind of want to mention, because I don't think we've talked about it much today, is the idea of the union. So in London, of course, the taxi driver union is incredibly strong. And I was talking to somebody, and the Chennai taxi union, for example, is much stronger than Bangalore, which has therefore just lost the Kalapiri taxis because it didn't have a strong union. And so it seems to me that in terms of people who can intervene, the kind of absence of the union is actually a big kind of, a big factor in kind of this idea of who the employee is, where they're located, who defends their rights, because their rights in itself is immediately done away with when they're given the tag of an entrepreneur. So it's this kind of, giving with one hand and taking away with another, that kind of neoliberal kind of trick, bait and switch.
Specifically in response to the last thing you said about the union. I'd like to think that strong unions would stop this, but I suspect that the best they'll do is delay it, because if you look at what happened in New York, there was a time when New York medallions used to go for, $1 million because just demand and supply. But it also meant that, they had medical insurance, there was, but essentially Uber took over. I mean, Uber and many other forms of,
Lyft and all that as well.
not just Uber and Lyft. I mean, now you have these smart cars which you can get into and sort of pay and leave anywhere you want. But I can't see yellow cabs ever being more than a niche. I mean, where once they roamed over Manhattan, like the Lords of the Realm, I don't think that's going to happen anymore because, and they had fairly powerful organized unions, but it availed them very little in the end because there is something completely seductive to the middle class imagination about Amazon and Uber. I mean, the levels of convenience are ridiculous. The other day I caught myself buying AAA batteries on Amazon. I mean, simply because I was on my machine. It's just.
It's true.
I think we're running out of time. I'd like to just kind of end by saying that I hope this complicates the issue of how we look at Uber and how we treat drivers, and I hope everyone can improve their ratings and their behavior towards drivers. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
for
Thank you very much
joining
for
this
having me.
discussion.